What if I told you the only reason you're hearing this in English is because half of Europe died almost 700 years ago? The Black Death wasn't just a health crisis, it was a cultural execution. Latin was the language of God. French was the language of kings. English? That was the mumbling of mud-splattered peasants. Then the plague came, and everything changed. Chapter 1. Setting the stage. Before the plague, England spoke 3 languages, but only one mattered. In the 14th century, Latin ruled the sacred. It was the language of priests, monks, universities, and the law. Every Bible, every sermon, every official record was written in Latin and spoken by the educated few. If you wanted to read at all, you had to learn Latin first. Next came French. Not the French of Paris, but Anglo-Norman, a dialect brought across the Channel in 1066, when William the Conqueror's Norman army crushed the Anglo-Saxons at the Battle of Hastings and seized the English throne. From that moment on, French became the tongue of power. Royal charters were written in it. Trials were conducted in it. If you wanted to argue in court, inherit land, or serve the king, you needed French, or you were dismissed as irrelevant. French wasn't just a language, it was a password. And English? English was the language of the conquered. It was a mutt of tongues, a Germanic dialect descended from Old Saxon, with influences from Frisian, Norse and Anglian speech. There were no grammar rules, dictionaries or standardized spellings, just a messy, regional code passed on orally. English was one of dozens of low-born languages spoken across medieval Europe, no more special than Flemish or Low German. No one expected it to survive, especially not in the shadow of 2 giants like Latin and French. To speak English was to speak powerlessly. It was the language of cowherds and bakers, stable boys and thatchers, unrecorded, unrespected, unworthy. Few could even read it, not because it was hard, but because literacy itself was rare. By most estimates, only around 1 to 2% of the population could read at all, and those who did were usually clergy or nobility. If you were literate, you read Latin. If you were powerful, you spoke French. English was for talking, never for writing. Then in 1348, a ship arrived from the south coast, and everything that seemed permanent began to rot. Chapter 2. The Black Death strikes. The plague didn't sneak into Europe, it was launched like a weapon. In the 1340s, the port city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Crimean Peninsula, was under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde. Their leader, Jani Beg, faced a dilemma. His army was dying of a mysterious disease, so he turned the dead into ammunition. In one of the earliest known acts of biological warfare, the Mongols catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls. As the bodies burst and rotted in the streets, the defenders had no idea what they were fighting. Some historians think the real infection didn't come from the sky, but from the rats that ran freely between camps and ships. Either way, Kaffa fell to disease before it fell to swords. The Genoese, desperate to escape, fled by sea, unwittingly carrying death to every port they touched. By late 1347, 12 Genoese galleys docked in Sicily. Within days, the plague tore through the island. From there, it spread north, Genoa, Venice, Pisa, with 6 sailors dying in their bunks as rats and fleas multiplied below deck. In Marseille, a single infected ship sparked an epidemic that tore through France. By June 1348, the plague reached England, carried across the Channel by trade and blood. It didn't stop. The disease moved faster than any medieval army. By 1349, it was in Norway, Scotland and Germany. In 1353, it reached Moscow. It swirled across continents, sparing only the most isolated villages or places with minimal trade. But in urban Europe, where pigs walked the streets, chamber pots rained from windows and humans lived shoulder to shoulder with rats, it was a perfect storm. The people were already weak. Malnutrition was rampant. A generation earlier, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 had devastated crops and immune systems. The plague didn't need help. It arrived in a population primed for death, and that death came in waves. The first outbreak in Constantinople killed the emperor's son. It returned 10 more times before 1400. Across Europe, cities recorded death rates between 30% and 60%. An estimated 25 to 50 million Europeans died. In London alone, 60,000 of its 100,000 residents are believed to have perished from the plague. In some towns, every household was wiped out. In others, so many died that mass graves became the norm, and priests stopped performing funerals. The world was vanishing in real time, and with it, the people who spoke Latin in the pulpit and French in the courtroom. The dead left behind only silence, and soon that silence would be filled by English. Chapter 3: Chaos and Collapse. The plague didn't just kill bodies, it killed institutions. Across Europe, churches fell silent. Monasteries that once housed dozens of Latin literate monks became plague pits. Parish priests died so rapidly that in some regions, up to half of all churches were left without a single clergyman. Desperate to fill pulpits, bishops ordained anyone who could mumble a sermon. Barely trained, barely literate, barely alive. The church wasn't just wounded, it was disfigured. Universities closed, religious orders vanished. With so few left to conduct mass or interpret scripture, the entire Latin instruction and ritual system began to collapse. And that collapse brought fear. Unable to explain the disease, medieval society descended into superstition and blame. Some said the stars had shifted, others blamed earthquakes or sin, but many blamed other people. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. In Strasbourg, over 2,000 were burned alive in 1349. Entire communities were destroyed in Mainz, Cologne, and beyond. By 1351, more than 200 Jewish settlements had been wiped out across Europe. Survivors fled east, many finding refuge under King Casimir the Great of Poland. But the frenzy didn't stop there. Lepers, beggars, foreigners, friars, and the visibly sick were hunted down and killed. People with acne or skin conditions were murdered as suspected plague carriers. Flagellants roamed town to town, whipping their own backs in public squares to atone for the sins of humanity. In some cities they were welcomed. In others they spread more fear and more plague. Faith didn't vanish, but it fractured. Out of the wreckage of organized religion came something smaller. Lay guilds emerged. People prayed at home. Private rituals replaced formal ceremonies. A new kind of devotion spread, quieter, intimate and local. Meanwhile, feudalism, already fragile, began to crack. Lords couldn't collect rent from the dead. Peasants demanded higher wages or walked away. With labour scarce and land suddenly abundant, the rigid hierarchy of medieval life no longer held. Even the church, Europe's most powerful institution, couldn't mask the damage. Cardinal Francis Gasquet called the post-plague church more than half ruined. And in that ruin, where monks once copied Latin by candlelight, English began to seep in. Chapter 4: The Rise of English. The plague didn't simply hollow out Europe's population, it hollowed out its voice. Latin and French had ruled for centuries, but after 1348, the people who spoke, taught and enforced them were gone. In the void, English rose, not by revolution but by default. Monasteries were abandoned, the clergy decimated, and the universities where Latin had been sacred went silent. French nobles died alongside their scribes, and the infrastructure of multilingual governance collapsed. And suddenly, English wasn't just the language of the peasantry, it was the language of survivors. In 1362, the Statute of Pleading made English legally usable in courtrooms for the first time since the Norman Conquest. Not out of patriotism, but because no one understood French anymore. Schools reopened and began teaching in English. Government proclamations were issued in English. sermons were preached in English, because it was the only language that people could still understand. By the 1380s, Geoffrey Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales in a voice that mixed courtly speech with street dialect. English wasn't just practical, it was becoming powerful. The elite languages had fallen with the elite. What was left was English. Resilient, unpolished, and suddenly necessary. Chapter 5. The Irony of Survival. The Black Death had no ideology, no preference. It killed priests and prisoners, nobles and nuns. But what came after? That was anything but equal. Feudalism buckled, fields went unploughed, labourers vanished, and those who remained, they could walk away. For the first time, peasants could negotiate or leave. The land was empty, and power followed the survivors. Even public health began to evolve. In 1377, the port of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, instituted the first documented quarantine. New arrivals had to wait 30 days before entering. Later it became 40. The Italian word, quarantino or quarantine. That legacy still lives in our vocabulary today. English didn't rise because it was strong. It rose because everything else had crumbled. Without the Black Death, English might have remained a dialect of stable boys and swineherds. Instead, it became the last language standing. Chapter 6. Reflection and Wrap-Up. The Black Death didn't just devour souls. It annihilated systems. It erased hierarchies. It burned down a world built on Latin and French. And in the silence that followed, English stepped forward. Today, it's the most spoken language on earth. But that legacy didn't begin in triumph. It began in plague pits, in silence, in survival. English didn't rise through glory. It rose through ashes, through silence, through death. The Black Death ended countless lives, but it gave one forgotten language a second chance. Because every death leaves a trace, and every trace tells a story.